Hello chess fans, this is Rick from Chess to Impress with coverage of Game 11 of the 2021 World Championship match between the champion Magnus Carlsen from Norway and his challenger Ian Nepomniachtchi from Russia. The match was held in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates in the exhibition center there. And this is a picture of the handshake before Game 11. The score after 10 games, 6.5 to 3.5 in favor of the champion. So Nepomniachtchi had to start winning games very quickly. He needed 3 wins in the last 4 games. He was white in Game 11. Let's see what happened. It is the 10th of December 2021 and Nepomniachtchi opened with the e-pawn. e5, we've seen it a lot in this match. Knight f3, knight c6. And we don't get a real Lopez, we get an Italian game in this game. Knight f6, d3, bishop c5, c3. The idea is of course to push d4 at the right moment. d6, Nepomniachtchi castled, and a7, a5, making room for the bishop on a7. And Carlsen is not afraid that his square on b5 will become a weakness. Rook e1, the bishop goes back voluntarily before it is being kicked back. Knight to a3, that knight might go to b5, but as we'll see in the game it will go back to c2 and then to e3. At this moment Fabiano Caruana explained why white cannot play d3, d4 immediately. Let's say black castles in this position and then you want to play d4. It looks logical, but it is not so good because after e takes, c takes, black can surprisingly take on e4. And if you take that piece, there is the fork. The rook has to retreat, black will win the piece back and knight takes c4. The dust has settled and black has the bishop pair and can play against the isolated pawn on d4. Black is better. Very instructive explanation from the previous challenger for the world title, Fabiano Caruana. In the game after knight a3, Carlsen did not castle, he played h6. The knight went to c2 as planned, Carlsen castled, bishop e3 and those bishops were swapped. We capture with the knight, rook e8 and a4. In one of the broadcasts I followed, the grandmasters were saying that queen b3, looking at the f7 square with 2 pieces, would have been a better try. But a4 was played, bishop e6 and also those bishops were swapped. Bishop takes and rook takes. Instead of bishop takes e6, bishop b5 keeps more material on the board, but also then it looks very equal. But Nepomniachtchi took on e6 instead, rook takes and queen b3 was played now. And now we understand why Nepomniachtchi played a2, a4, so that his queen will not be harassed by a5, a4 from black. Let's listen to Fabiano Caruana about this position.
This is getting very concrete and interesting because white has no strategic advantage now. The position is pretty much symmetrical with the same pieces and black is super solid. So I'm thinking his advantage, if there is one, is going to be of a purely concrete nature.
White is attacking the pawn on b7, so b6 is a logical move, and rook a2 d1, centralizing the rook. Knight d5 instead was suggested by Caruana. You cannot not take on d5 because there is e takes d5 and that wins a piece. But after knight d5 you can play knight back to e7. Knight takes f6 check, rook takes f6 and the rook might be slightly misplaced on f6, said Caruana. But also then it is not much for white. But after rook a d1, Carlsen decides to improve the knight on c6, which doesn't have any jumps forward. Those squares are controlled by white's c-pawn. So Carlsen goes to e7 with the knight. h3, with the idea of knight h2 to g4. The opening has been a success for black. The pawn structure is symmetrical and it's hard to see why this would be better for white. Queen d7 was played on move 16 by Carlsen. Let's hear Caruana again.
I think black equalizes very comfortably here.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like white has any reason to be better. It's certainly white's not worse, but what advantages does white have in this position? It's purely symmetrical and black is getting d5, which is his goal.
After queen d7, queen b5 was a move that was looked at in the live broadcast that I followed, but also then the position is roughly equal. In the game, Nepomniachtchi played knight h2 on move 17, rook was centralized, knight h to g4 and the knights were swapped. Nepomniachtchi took with the pawn and d5, and that was black's goal, as we heard Caruana mention. Black has fully equalized. Nepomniachtchi played d4, lots of tension there in the center, but the tension was broken straight away with e takes d4, attacking the knight, but Nepomniachtchi takes on d5, counter-attacking the rook. Rook saved itself, went to e4, and now queen c2, not saving the knight, but counter-attacking the rook again. The rook stepped aside, and now there is a variation which will lead to a draw very quickly. Undoubtedly, Nepomniachtchi had seen this. Rook takes d4 is the move, then rook takes, c takes, knight takes d5, the knights get swapped, white can take on c7, queen takes d4 and b3, and this is an equal position, and the game would undoubtedly have ended in a draw. But after rook f4, Nepomniachtchi did not go for that drawing variation. He played g3, and unfortunately that was a blunder. But it's hard to criticize Nepomniachtchi. He really had to win this game to keep any chances in the match, and because of that he had to avoid drawish variations. And he made a mistake with this move. It's not so obvious, but the engine points out straight away that black is winning after g3.
Look what happened. Isn't he gonna lose this game?
Yeah, he wants to lose this game. He wants to lose this game. He doesn't want to draw this game, so he wants to lose. No, but he just wants to lose. He doesn't want he doesn't want to play tomorrow. I think he just doesn't want to play tomorrow. But he basically honestly, I think he just wants to subconsciously just wants to lose rather than draw. He wants to win, of course, but rather than draw, because you have to play tomorrow. What are you gonna play, Petrov?
But what are we witnessing now?
And it is because of the exchange sacrifice, which Carlsen found. D takes e3 is very strong. Yes, white wins the exchange, but there is queen takes g4 check, and the white king is in big trouble. King f1 and queen h3 check, and you really cannot run away from the queen. You cannot go to e2 because there is queen g4 check, and if you go to d3, black wins the queen with queen f5 check. The king has to play and the queen on c2 is lost, and if after queen g4 check you take the pawn on e3, there is knight takes d5 check, and the white king will not survive this. So after queen h3 check, you cannot go to e2, and Nepomniachtchi saw that and went back to g1. So Carlsen now has a draw in hand if he repeats the moves with queen g4 check, but Carlsen had seen that he is winning here. The quickest win is with e takes f2 check, which was not found by Carlsen. Queen takes f2 and then rook d6, and there's nothing to do against the threat of rook g6. It will cost white the queen. E takes f2 check was not played. Rook d6 straight away is not good for black, because then there is rook takes a3, and if you play rook g6 check then there's a surprise. Queen takes g6 and white is winning here. The black queen is also hanging. What did Carlsen play after king g1? He played knight f5, and that's also a winning move, although not as quick as e takes f2 check. d6 found by Nepomniachtchi. He's going to get some counterplay with that pawn. You can take it, but Carlsen had calculated that knight h4 wins, and he played it. There's a checkmate threat on g2, and the only way to deal with that is by taking on e3. Now the queen is covering the g2 square. If you play knight f3 check, then there is king f2 only move, and queen h2 check wins the queen. But this is actually a way to throw away the win, because of that counterplay with the d-pawn. Let's look at the variation. King takes knight, and black wins the white queen, but there is d takes c7. And you cannot play rook c8, because it is white who wins this game of chess after rook d8 check. So after d takes c7, you have to take on d1, then white promotes with check, king h7, rook takes, queen takes, and this is a slightly better queen endgame for black. So all that after f takes e3 and then knight f3 check. In the game Carlsen played queen g3 check, king f1, and now played knight f3. Nepomniachtchi is trying to get the queens off. Queen f2, queen h3 check, queen g2, and the queens were indeed swapped. Black takes the exchange back that he was down, and after the rook recaptures, Black took on d6, and we have a rook endgame with an extra pawn for Black after all this. But it is a very good endgame for Black. He's controlling the d file, and also he has an outside passed pawn on the h file. King f3, rook d2 attacking the b pawn, rook b1 defending it in a passive way, g6, b4, a takes, and rook takes. If you take with the c pawn instead, then there is rook a2 and your a pawn is lost. So rook takes b4 was played, and rook a2, a very important move and very instructive. Black has to make sure that white will not be able to swap all the queenside pawns, as then the position would get quite drawish with 3 pawns against 2 on one side of the board. King e4, h5, Nepomniachtchi keeps going forward with the king, rook c2 attacking the c pawn, rook b3 defending it, h4, that pawn is on the run, king c6 looking for counterplay, h3, king takes c7, h2, you have to play rook b1 to make sure that pawn doesn't promote straight away, rook takes c3 check, the king takes another pawn, and now the a pawn becomes an asset for white, and Carlsen is going to play with the queen against the rook and the a pawn. He played rook b3 check, giving up on that rook. It has to be taken, and then the pawn can promote. a5 and queen e4, and let's hear Fabiano Caruana for the last time talking about this position.
Yeah, I think this endgame is far from simple, and although Magnus made it look very simple, especially with this nice queen to e4 move, and we saw later the nice king to g7 move, just one inaccuracy, and it's very easy to imagine white saving this game. And I'm sure queen e4 was seen in advance, and probably the reason he made the decision to go for this rather than f6, which also seemed pretty good, was because he saw queen e4 and white has no good way of coordinating the pieces. If white could get a6, a rook in front of the pawn like rook b8, a7, then we're already talking about Black taking a perpetual, trying to make a draw.
So not so easy at all for Black, and you and I would have probably not won this position against Nepomniachtchi. But Carlsen made it look very easy. The threat is queen e6 check. That would pick up the rook. So king a7 was played by Nepomniachtchi. Queen e7 check, king a8, and king g7. And the point is you cannot push the a pawn, because if you do, you lose the rook. After queen e6, attacking the a pawn and attacking the rook, and there's only one way to save both of them, rook a3, but then there is queen c8 check, king a7 only move, and a fork after all. Black will win the rook and the game. After king g7, Nepomniachtchi saw he cannot push the a pawn, he played rook b6, but then there was queen c5 attacking the a pawn, and if white wants to keep his a pawn, then he needs to play rook a6 in front of the pawn, after which Black will take on e3, and Black will create a new passed pawn on the king side and will win. After queen c5, Nepomniachtchi had enough, and he resigned. Not only this game, but also the match. Here we see the handshake, and after 11 games the 2021 World Championship concluded. And looking back, it is easy to see that game 6 was the turning point in this match. We started with 5 draws, and Nepomniachtchi might have had a little bit the better of the play. He had very good positions, especially in game 2 and also in game 5. But after that marathon game in game 6, which lasted almost 8 hours and 136 moves, it looks like Nepomniachtchi's spirit was broken. In the 5 following games, he was only able to make 2 draws and made some uncharacteristic mistakes. Carlsen picked up the pieces and very deservedly defended his world title for the 4th time, so he now is a 5-time world champion. I hope you liked this video and that you enjoyed the World Championship coverage on Chess to Impress. If you're new to my channel, I hope you will keep following me now that the match has concluded. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up, please subscribe to the Chess to Impress channel, and please leave a comment. I will read them all and I will reply to them all. If you liked the video, it would be great if you could share it on social media by clicking the share button on YouTube. You can find me on Instagram, on Twitter and on Facebook. This is Rick for Chess to Impress. Thank you for watching.